You'd have to live under a rock in this country if you haven't heard the clarion call to axe the tax. Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. The federal government's latest increase to the carbon tax is set to rise on April 1st. First introduced in 2019 at $20 a ton, the latest increase will see it rise from $65 a ton to $80 a ton. Politicized? Well, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre calls it a 23% increase. The Liberals point out works out to about 3 cents a litre at the pumps. Our Unpublished Vote question asks, do you receive the Canada Carbon Rebate? Yes, no, or unsure. You can cast your vote on this topic at Unpublished Vote. And don't forget to email your MP afterwards using our tool to tell them why you think what you do. All comments on the unpublished.ca website will be entered into a draw for a 1-year membership to unpublished.ca. You can log on and vote right now at Unpublished.vote. Joining us to discuss the carbon tax is Christopher Ragan, Associate Professor and Director at the Maxwell School of Public Policy at McGill University. And Christopher, you call the discussion around the carbon tax a dumpster fire. Politically, where does the blame lie?
Well, I'm not sure about the blame. Look, I think what we've got is a important policy. Most important policies, when they get introduced or talked about, they get debated a lot. There's political pushback. I don't think there are any big and important policies that haven't received political pushback over history. This one, I think, is getting lots of pushback. It is polarizing. Part of the reason why I called it a national dumpster fire is that I think there's not great information on both sides or all sides of this debate. I think the opponents of the carbon price are not really characterizing what's going on accurately, but I also think the defenders of the carbon price aren't doing a great job in explaining what they put in place and why and how it works and why it's sensible. So it's not us at our political best, I would say.
No. If 80% of Canadians do get the rebate, why is there such support for, quote, axing the tax?
A great question. So 80%, so the rebate only applies for the federal carbon price. So this is a discussion that's not happening in British Columbia and not happening in Quebec because they have their own carbon pricing systems. So the discussion is really all about the federal carbon price. And if you're in a province, 8 provinces that have the federal carbon price, then there's also a rebate. And this is part of the problem, is that the government has done a poor job in explaining that there are rebates and what the logic is of those rebates and the size of those rebates. So there's a lot of people that just don't know those rebates are there. The opponents of the carbon price complain about the carbon price, but they're not talking about the rebates at all. And so one of the problems here is that a lot of opposition to the carbon price is, the allegation that the carbon price is making life unaffordable. Well, that's a nice line, but it's simply not true because 80% of the households, or at least these rebates, are calibrated, they're constructed so that 80% of the households in each of those provinces are getting more back in the rebate than they're actually paying at the pumps. So that's just true, but it gets ignored, I suspect, intentionally by those people that like to, talk about the bad aspects of the tax.
Yeah, when you look at Canada's emissions versus, say, China or India, which dwarf us, many feel the carbon tax is a waste of time considering those people are not doing anything. How do you square that circle?
Yeah, look, I get that argument, but that argument is basically to say, well, look, we've got this global problem called climate change, and Canada is a really small country. We are a 1.5 or 1.6% of global emissions. So you can clearly kind of say that, it's the bigger countries that are the source of the problem, not small countries like Canada, but it is a global problem. And so I don't think Canadians want to free ride on the actions of other countries. I don't think Canadians want to tell other countries to actually try to solve this problem when we're not going to do our fair share. I actually think that Canadians want to be part of the solution because we're all part of the problem as well. I mean, we are all responsible for emitting greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, by the way, Canadians on a per capita basis have way higher emissions than almost every other country. So to me, it is about engaging with other countries and encouraging all countries to do more in terms of addressing climate change, but at the same time, to come back home and to do what we can. And, so you don't have to use a carbon price. You can use other methods. But a carbon pricing, the reason why economists like carbon pricing is because it works to reduce emissions and it is a way lower cost way to do it than anything else we've ever invented. And that's part of the thing that's lost in the debate.
In terms of what Quebec and BC are doing, how are we seeing a lot of reticence towards that pricing of carbon in those provinces? Do you know?
So also a great question. So look, in Quebec, I live in Quebec. This is Montreal right behind me. Quebec has a cap and trade system. That's a different form of a carbon price, but it's a carbon price that drives up the price of gasoline and diesel and home heating fuel and natural gas, exactly like the federal system. But it is a less visible system. It's a more complicated behind the scenes system. Nobody talks about it in this province. Like, we got lots of other stuff we talk about, which you may have talked about on your show.
Oh, yeah.
So there's lots of stuff to complain about if you want to complain about the government in Quebec, but nobody's talking about the cap and trade system, the carbon pricing system here. In British Columbia, it was introduced by a small C conservative government, Gordon Campbell, back in 2006, if I'm not mistaken. And it was introduced with offsetting income tax cuts. And as far as I know, in BC, it is not a headline issue. It's not a coffee house issue. It's just not an issue. But politically, the federal carbon price has become an issue. But I note that, again, that the people that are opposed to the carbon price, whether they're politicians or not, the people that are opposed to the federal carbon price, they aren't suggesting an alternative. And that makes you almost believe that maybe they don't care about climate change, but they don't say that. So if they care about climate change, they should say that. And if they care about climate change, but they don't like a carbon price, then I would hope that they would kind of see the onus on them to suggest an alternative. And here we come back to the basics, which is, if you want to address greenhouse gas emissions and try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with some other method, like very intrusive regulations or subsidies that tend to be very expensive, you can do that. You don't need a carbon price, but they are going to be way worse for the economy. And that's why economists support carbon pricing.
I was going in that direction, that there was no real alternative being offered by Pierre Poilievre. And I guess the question is, if he wins the next election, they talk about getting rid of it. We've heard no other plan. Maybe there is no other plan.
Well,
then what?
I think that's a legitimate fear. Now, look, I think most leaders of the opposition don't start talking about their policy details until you get much closer to the election campaign, and maybe actually the election campaign. So it may be the case that, and I'm no political strategist, but it may be the case that political strategy 101 today is that if you're an opposition leader, you don't give anybody a target which means precise policy details until you have to. And maybe that's only the 40 days of the election campaign. So maybe that means for another 16 months, we only hear what the opposition dislikes, but we don't hear what they like. But there is a fear here that if people are going to just oppose the carbon tax and not suggest an alternative, then at least we could be forgiven for thinking that maybe they don't care about the problem at all. And I would hope that any politician in this country who actually doesn't care about climate change would say that, have the decency and the honesty to say, yeah, well, we don't care about climate change. We just don't think it's a big problem. Well, then let's have that debate. By the way, some of the opposition says, well, we think technology is the answer. Well, that's not even a great bumper sticker, but it's certainly not a policy. Technology doesn't just happen. Technology happens for all kinds of reasons, partly because, response to economic conditions. So a carbon tax, I would argue, will help to drive innovation. It's not the only way to drive innovation, but I think if you're just going to say, well, technology will be the answer, then that's not much of an answer.
No, it's pretty broad. Just recently, the Bank of Canada issued a warning about the country's declining productivity. Now, is this related to the cost of the carbon tax?
Oh, I would say not at all. Look,
No?
productivity has been a problem in this country for quite some time, long before carbon pricing was introduced.
Hmm.
And, I think productivity is one of the, we could probably have a separate podcast on this, but productivity growth there's an irony here because it's probably the single most important thing that drives living standards over the long run, right? If you want to know why we are better off on average than our great grandparents, it's basically about productivity growth over long, long periods of time. So it's the single most important thing for driving long run living standards, but it's also probably the thing that governments around the world have the least really good understanding of. Like I spent 18 months in the Department of Finance. I spent, a couple of different 1-year periods at the Bank of Canada. I promise you there is no policy lever labeled productivity growth in either of those organizations, right? There's no simple way.
Yeah.
But the effect of the carbon price with the rebates, right, which is effectively a tax reduction, I think would have approximately no impact on productivity growth.
Christopher, I want to thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Christopher Ragan is the Associate Professor and Director at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. Our Unpublished Vote question asks, do you receive the Canada Carbon Rebate? Yes, no, or unsure. You can log on and vote right now. Joining us to continue our look at the carbon tax is Ralph Torrie. He's Director of Research for Corporate Knights. And Ralph, you say it's time for a grown-up conversation about the carbon tax. Why do you feel that way?
Well, this is a nuanced issue. Unfortunately, considering the state of the political discourse in this country, it's an issue that requires a calm, informed conversation, not the kind of shouting match that seems to be developing between the Conservatives and the Liberals, where people are reverting to slogans and so on. Carbon tax, carbon pricing in general is not simple, and it works in some situations and it doesn't work in others. And we need to be smart enough to know where to use it and when there's a need for more direct and more effective methods for getting our greenhouse gas emissions down.
You say there are places that it works and some places that it doesn't. Can you give us examples of both?
Well, we actually have two carbon pricing or carbon taxing systems in Canada. One gets applied basically at the household level, and we all see it. We see it at the pump. We see it on our heating bill, and it's annoying, and it's not that effective, however, at changing our behavior, especially for lower income households who may not have the capital or the access to the credit necessary to buy the heat pump or to trade up to an electric vehicle, or whatever it would take to avoid having to pay increasing carbon taxes. They need help with those capital investments, and taxing them isn't going to do anything but make their life a bit more miserable, as far as I can tell. So yes, there's a rebate, which is one of the complicating factors, but we all know what it's like when you're just trying to make ends meet. Your February heating bill goes up. You stretch things to make ends meet. Maybe you put a little bit more on your credit card that month, and then your rebate money shows up a few months later. And maybe you pay your credit card down a bit. You buy some shoes for the kids. Maybe you go out and have a night on the town, but you're not going to go out and buy a heat pump with a $200 or $300 rebate. So there's a problem with its effectiveness at getting behavior change on the ground at the household level. It doesn't work that well. The economists are wrong about the effectiveness of the carbon tax at that level. We have a second system. It applies the same carbon price, but this time it applies it to the big polluters, to the energy-intensive industries. It has a complicated name even. It's called the output-based pricing system. And in that case, carbon pricing can be quite effective. If you are a company in the steel making business or cement or pulp and paper or the oil and gas industry itself, for that matter, where fuel costs are a big deal for you, it's a big part of your operating cost structure, then a tax on carbon for those industries will spur innovation. It will get them to go looking for lower carbon ways of doing what they do. And it does work. And other countries around the world are doing this. So we have to do it in that case, because if we don't, those countries are going to start slapping tariffs on our energy intensive exports. So that's what I meant when I said earlier, this is not, unfortunately, it's just not that simple an issue. The pricing system for industry, I think if anything, it should be made stronger. There's too many loopholes that companies have been allowed to go through on that have lowered what they're actually paying in carbon tax. But at the retail level, it's not nothing. I mean, it creates an atmosphere of support and understanding that there's an issue. But if we really want to change behavior and get the investments we need at the household level on this, we need much more direct and much more effective measures than what the carbon tax is able to deliver, especially considering the urgency of the issue at this point.
So, it sounds like you think carbon pricing has been oversold. You think there's better ways of doing it?
Well, I certainly think that when it comes to that retail level, at the household level, the small firm, where the contribution of fuel to the total cost of what's really driving value, which is to have a comfortable home and a vehicle, or to make whatever it is you're in the manufacturing business to make, or in the service sector to make, in all of those areas, the contribution that fossil fuel costs make to your overall cost of doing things is so small that taxing it is not an effective or an efficient way to get emissions down in those situations. Think of, for example, there's appliance efficiency standards in this country. It costs very little to implement those. And yet when you buy a refrigerator today, you don't have to worry about it being energy inefficient because it's regulated that it must be. The same thing goes for building codes. When you buy a new house in this country, you're assured that it's going to reach a certain minimum level of energy efficiency because of the building codes that we use. When you buy a new car, there's information and there are standards that control the efficiency, the fuel efficiency of that vehicle. So in all of these situations, we have clear examples that common sense alone would tell you we're much more effective, much quicker at getting the job done than a tax would have been. I mean, can you imagine the tax it would take on electricity to get the appliance industry to make a better refrigerator compared to how easy it was to do it by and they actually agreed with this. The appliance industry itself sat down with Ronald Reagan, not exactly an anti-free market president, and they said, can we just have standards for this, please? That's the best, cheapest, most effective way to get the job done. We don't want to compete on energy efficiency. We want to compete on the beauty of the color of our fridges or the sleekness of our ice makers or whatever it is that they're using to sell their fridges. So that's, I guess, the one point I'd really like to leave is that when it works, it's a great tool, and it's especially effective in situations where energy costs are really high and where the pathway forward is uncertain. It can spur the innovation that is necessary to find the low carbon solutions for those big, heavy polluting industries that need to change if they're going to survive. But for the vast majority of households and small companies and manufacturing outfits and so on, it's not the best way to get the job done. It's been oversold.
Ralph, I want to thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your interest.
Ralph Torrie is the Director of Research for Corporate Knights. While there is a lot of hot air out there on either side of this discussion, the bottom line is, how do Canadians feel? John Rowe is a research analyst with the Angus Reid Institute, and he joins us now. And John, did Angus Reid do any work on this issue when the carbon price was first introduced?
Yeah, we've been doing polling on this dating back to kind of when it was first discussed by the Liberal government in 2018, or kind of as this policy was kind of being pushed forward. And what we've seen over time is that the support has kind of gone downwards. Initially, it was a very popular project. People could get behind it. I think they understood how it could possibly work to kind of reduce emissions. And then I think as time has gone on and they've kind of seen the realities of the program, and especially I think since the cost of living has gone up in recent years, people now are less supportive of the program. And I think they're more worried about how it's affecting their kind of day-to-day lives and those costs.
We've heard a lot on both sides of the discussion about Canadians, and they feel they can't afford it, can't afford things now because of the carbon tax. And I'm wondering, was Angus Reid able to take a look at, how the residents of Quebec and BC are happy with, or how happy they might be with their system in terms of carbon?
Yeah, we pulled on that as well. So obviously BC has kind of a separate carbon tax, whereas Quebec has its own kind of carbon pricing system. And I think there are kind of big differences between those and the federal programs. And in general, people in BC and Quebec are much kind of more supportive of their own programs than, say, the program is federally. But traditionally, people in BC and Quebec, I would say, are a bit more concerned about the environment in general, I think, than other Canadians, a bit more kind of attuned to kind of those matters. And I think one of the big factors, too, for Quebec is that their carbon pricing is not as high as the rest of the country. So they perhaps maybe aren't nearly as effective maybe as those kind of price increases that are coming. But those are kind of two of the big factors I think kind of play into it, where BC and people in Quebec are a bit more satisfied with their programs.
Most feel the carbon tax is making life unaffordable for them. But when you take what it applies, carbon tax, to inflation, apparently it's like 0.05% of what inflation is. That doesn't seem to be steeped in reality, though, does it?
Well, I think it's kind of one of those things that's very difficult for Canadians to kind of understand. I mean, all they know is that everything that they kind of pay into that has that uses carbon, which is a lot of things that kind of factor into the economy, is more expensive because there's a tax on it. So I think people, like, if you're as an economist, and I've seen those kind of reports where it's saying, okay, well, this is how much it actually is affecting prices, kind of comparing to other countries who don't have carbon pricing in effect. You can kind of understand that, I think, but from a Canadian's perspective, all they kind of hear is that, okay, well, the price of carbon's going up on April 1st. It's gone up over the last couple of years. That tax doesn't necessarily have to exist, maybe in some people's minds, and they feel it must be playing an effect as these prices kind of go upwards.
In your work out in the field, which Canadians that you found do support the carbon tax?
Well, I think it's what we found is that one of the big factors is whether or not they feel that they're getting more money back from that rebate, and whether or not they actually get that rebate. So we asked Canadians in kind of the affected provinces in the fall, and as well just a couple weeks ago, whether or not they had received a rebate in the last year, and whether or not they felt like that rebate covered the amount of money they pay in carbon taxes. And that's kind of a huge factor in determining whether or not people support it. So the people that did say they were sure they got a rebate, as well as believe that they got more money back on that rebate than they put into the system, they're like, oh yeah, I support the carbon tax. I kind of buy into this. As well, there is a lot of a political lean to these discussions. The people who are more likely to vote Conservative are less supportive of the tax. And we see that as kind of the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, is going out there and campaigning in some ways on how he would axe the tax as if he formed government. So, and Liberals and NDP voters are much more kind of supportive of the tax. So those are kind of the big elements at play here, I'd say.
Do you see this becoming the defining issue of the next federal election?
I think it plays. It will play a big factor for sure, I think, especially because it seems like the federal government and the Trudeau Liberals are kind of very kind of stuck in on this in a lot of ways, despite the fact that they did kind of weaken the system in Atlantic Canada, and for people that didn't buy the exemption for home heating oil, which does apply across the country, but kind of is in somewhat a political play to Atlantic Canada, where that fuel is used a bit more. So I think as long as the Trudeau Liberals kind of stay stuck in on it, and the price keeps going up, and it's scheduled to go up next year as well as this year on April 1st, I think that it has to kind of play into the election. It does seem to be pushing a lot of people in some ways towards the Conservatives, because they see it as a cost of living issue, an affordability issue. And that's kind of one of the ways you could actually I guess, meaningfully address these affordability problems in the eyes of Canadians is by removing that carbon tax.
Yeah, when you take a look at the inflation rate, we talk about the cost of living and obviously unaffordability for Canadians. Last month it was 2.8%. So the Bank of Canada is getting close to its 2% mark again. If they get down to 2%, the argument that everything is costing you more when the numbers say it's not, I think it loses its air, does it not?
Yeah, you would think so in a lot of ways, and I think the issue though is that even though perhaps the inflation kind of goes down to that 2%, it's gone up so much, and the cost of everything's kind of gone up so much in the last couple of years that even if it's like, okay, well, the stats are telling you now that prices aren't increasing so much, well, a lot of people are still going to be like, well, everything's still a lot more expensive than it was a few years ago. Is there any way we can deal with those issues? And I think kind of separate to that too is that a lot of what inflation or is driving kind of the remaining bit above the Canada target right now is kind of housing inflation and rental inflation. And so those kind of issues in some ways, maybe like even if we get down to 2%, seem like they're a bit more sticky harder to solve, which maybe does not have a lot to do with the carbon tax, but does kind of play into the minds of Canadians when they're like, okay, well, I'm trying to live my life. And all these things, the most important things, groceries have increased a lot in the last couple of years. And housing has increased a lot in the couple of years. And even if you say, okay, well, the prices aren't increasing as fast, well, they still feel more expensive to me.
John, I want to thank you for joining us.
No, thanks for having me on, Ed.
John Rowe is a research analyst with the Angus Reid Institute. Our Unpublished Vote question asks, do you receive the Canada Carbon Rebate? Yes, no, or unsure. I want to thank our guests today on the Unpublished Cafe, Christopher Ragan from McGill University, Ralph Torrie of Corporate Knights, and John Rowe with the Angus Reid Institute. And I want to thank you for watching the Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.